She was good.
Yeah, she was great.
Did I say it right? So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And if you haven't, please take a moment to sign in, grab an evaluation, and handouts of both the slides and 2 articles. Today, the Prevention Research Center and the Maternal and Child Health Leadership Training Program are sponsoring our last communication seminar of the semester, and we're very happy to have Dr. Kat Thiel, who's an associate professor in the Department of Community Health and Behavioral Sciences in the Maternal and Child Health section. She is a contributing researcher to the Prevention Research Center's core research and overall mission to address the social and environmental factors that influence the obesity epidemic. She's also the director of the Mary Amelia Douglas Whitehead Women's Health Education Center, and she was recently named the Cecile Houston Professor in Women's Health. Her research and teaching interests span both practical and theoretical social epi, including women and children's health, community and social network influences on health outcomes, race and gender inequities, substance use and mental health, and social epi theory and methods. Dr. Thiel received her MPH in epi from Emory and her PhD in epi from Tulane. And before joining us here at Tulane as faculty, she worked as an assistant professor of epidemiology at LSU. And she's very prolific. She has published over 40 peer-reviewed papers and presented over 50 scientific talks. And we're very happy. Obscure journal.
That's really sweet. Yeah, I have published in many obscure journals. So one of the articles I have for you today talks about publishing, just the article about publishing. Every research topic, every research paper has a home. The goal is prestige, but when that doesn't happen, there are many options. So before I get started, I wanted to get a feel for your experience. How many of you have written a scientific paper? Okay. How many of you have published a scientific paper? How many of you are currently working on your own research about someone else's research in which you'll be publishing? Okay. Yeah, so pretty diverse. It's broad. This is, I was telling Naomi, for public health, we are such an interdisciplinary field that it is, there's no one guideline for writing a paper in public health because we are so diverse. It's not bench science. I mean, we're a mix. We're a mix of bench science. We're a mix of community-based service. You name it. So writing a paper is sometimes challenging. I will also point out that we have Dr. Bensel in the audience too, so she probably will be a great resource. And I want you to stop me throughout this if you have any questions. I'm going to go through the slides, but I really want a lot of dialogue at the end, and I want to be able to answer any questions you might have, if I can. So, learning objectives for this seminar, I want you to walk away being able to understand the value of manuscripts and adding to the scientific base. I want you to have some understanding about how you determine and test your research question. That, in and of itself, is an entire degree. But I'll mention briefly just some things to keep in mind as you think about your research questions. We're going to talk about the types of publications and the best fit for your work, although I will focus this on scientific research papers in particular. And then we'll talk about different parts of the scientific paper and how we might approach them as we write. So why is it important to publish? We have an obligation, ethical obligation to participants and to society. We also publish to get our work out there. We want to have a public health and clinical impact, and we want our results to reflect that. We also publish to inform policymaking, and again, that kind of feeds into having a public health impact. If our work is never out there at that level, we won't have that impact. We also publish to secure future grant applications. The work you do now is a building block for what you will do down the road, and so it's essential to publish if you want to be funded. And then if you are in academia, promotion and tenure depend on funding. So, or you have to publish. Will your work make the world a better place? Easier said than done. It will in a small way. Every research paper published adds to the scientific base. And so this is taken from Duke's library. And here we have different types of evidence based on the scientific rigor of the work. And you can see, again, we have filtered information, which includes things like systematic reviews, meta-analyses, critically appraised topics. These are all filtered information so that individual papers or projects have been taken and synthesized to some extent to better inform our evidence base. We have unfiltered information, which is where your research study might fall. And depending on the type of research and the type of study design, it might provide a greater weight in terms of evidence base. So randomized controlled trials are stronger than cohort studies, stronger than case controlled studies, case series, and so on. So your one individual study will definitely add to the evidence base on the topic. It's important, though, too, to look through conference proceedings and unpublished works, because a lot of times there's what we call publication bias. And so some journals are biased in that they want to publish positive results. And so a lot of the literature we see are results that are positive or have an impact. But if we're going to determine the evidence on the topic, we want to see positive and negative. And so a lot of times you won't find negative findings as often as you will positive results. So your work does add to the base. A key point, though, I want you to remember is that your one study or a single research study never proves that a risk factor or an intervention or a program or a policy causes a disease or health outcome. It just provides evidence of an association. Really key to kind of always put your work into the bigger context. So that's important to remember. As great as your study might be, it still is just one study. So it's important to publish. We all get that. How, though, do you go about determining your research questions, and how do you go about testing the question? That's really going to depend on the stage in your career and your interest, of course. Research is very broad, and so your questions are going to be very broad depending on where you are. It will also depend on the data that's available to you and the types of studies you can design, of course, resources, funding. Determining your question is one thing, testing is a whole other realm. Testing your question is going to depend on the data, it's going to depend on the study design, it's going to depend on the variables that go into your research question. There are a lot of factors that go into play in determining what your question is and how you might test that. There are many different types and objectives of research. I've just listed some broad categories here, but again, your research might be qualitative, it might be quantitative, more numeric-based. These are two broad categories, and within them there are very different types of research. You might be conducting research purely for descriptive reasons, which is a goal in and of itself. But testing that research question is going to be very different than testing an explanatory research question, something that you want to test a hypothesis about. Exploratory research might just be more, it's conducted more to generate hypotheses, more than just testing. So those are three broad different purposes of research. Your work might be short-term, it might be long-term. Either of those two is going to gauge how you test your question. And you might be doing determinants research, or you might be doing intervention research. So by determinants, I mean etiologic research. You might be searching for a risk factor or some factor that it might impact a health outcome. Or it might be that you're actually intervening, maybe at the individual level, the clinic level, the policy level. Those are two broad categories of research, and the study designs that inform them and that are used to test those questions that come from that research are all very different. So it's going to depend. In public health, most of our research is conducted to improve health or increase our understanding of the production of health. But again, we're very, very interdisciplinary. So we've got a lot of bench science and we've got a lot of policy. So what you do depends on where you are and your interests. No matter what type of research you're conducting, though, it will all follow a basic process, and I've listed those here. The first step is to identify and develop your topic and the type of research you want to conduct. And also, first and foremost is developing your research question, because your research question is going to gauge everything else you do, from study design to data collection, you name it. The second step is to choose your target population and the appropriate design to answer that question with. And the sample size is always key if you're doing quantitative research. And then the third step is developing data collection and tools for data collection and the methods that you want to employ. The fourth overall step is to collect and process the data, and then finally we analyze the data, or actually test our research question. Much of the work in research is done way beyond and way before testing. And then finally we want to report our results, both in scientific papers as well as throughout the community, for many of us at public health. Defining your research question, again, it's going to depend on where you are in your field, but there's some general rules of thumb. One is that it should ideally be grounded in a theoretical framework. And that's really important in terms of situating your research within the larger context of public health and what the area that you're contributing to. It should build on, but also offer something new to your field and to previous research. And it should have the potential to suggest directions for future research. And it should be something, of course, that you're interested in or invested in. Otherwise, your research won't last. And it should address directly or indirectly some real problem, which for us in public health is typically the case. Your questions should also take ethical issues into consideration. So there's some research questions we can't ask because of the ethical issues. And it should clearly state the variables or the constructs that you want to examine. It should not be biased in terminology or position, and it should be simple, quantifiable, and measurable. So it's got to be something you can test in some way, shape, or form. And again, like I said, your research question is going to drive everything else, every other part of your research. And I think I've some examples. So this is an example. The first question I have here is not as specific. So let's say I'm interested, I've designed an intervention, and I'm interested in whether this female and culturally specific intervention is successful at reducing the risk of HIV among women who use drugs. And that's fine. It's a good research question, but it's not as specific as I need it to be if I'm going to operationalize my data collection tools, really understand about what I'm going to be collecting in this study. So more specifically, a better question might be whether the intervention was successful at increasing condom use, so a particular type of sexual risk behavior, and decreasing the number of sexual partners, so we know that I can measure those two things, I can quantify them, and specifically I'm looking at women who use crack cocaine, and I'm comparing my intervention to a standard intervention. So again, that's a more specific question that would gauge my design, what I'm including in my survey. In this case, it was quantitative, that sort of thing. I can go further too and maybe say, look at mediation. So is the effect of my intervention actually mediated by perceived control, another construct I might measure in my survey, because I've used a theory that takes into account perceived control. So again, making it as specific as you can. The hypothesis is a statement of the association or the test of your research question. It is either one-tailed or two-tailed. For those of you who have taken Biostats 101, you've probably written a few hypotheses. The null hypothesis states that there's an association. And so when we're going about testing our research question in a quantitative research setting, we're always testing the hypothesis. So it's important to publish. Determining your question and testing your question are extremely dependent on where you are, and there are a lot of things that go into determining your question and testing it. Once you've conducted your research, though, and tested your question and found a wonderful result, we want to get it out there. And there are different types of publications that we use. most often in public health. And so, again, I'm going to speak about what we use here in our field. I will talk mostly about the scientific paper, but we have a few other types, and I'll show you some examples. Most of you are familiar with the scientific paper, and we'll go through those sections. But we also have what are called research briefs or letters. And this is, if you read American Journal of Public Health, you'll see these shorter snippets of research, easier to write, of course, because they are shorter. And it's often written to get something out in a very timely way, or perhaps to respond to a published work with your results, maybe contradicting what that author found with what you have. There are various reasons for writing briefs, but they are pretty common, and one quick and dirty way to get things out or to respond. There are also what we call field action reports, and these are, again, probably more common in public health because they are action-based. I'll show you an example of one that just reports on a project in the community. And so they're important, particularly for those of us doing community-based work, and another type of publication. Review articles are just that, usually systematic reviews, meta-analyses. These are more synthesized bodies of work looking at a particular topic or research question. And then we have letters to the editor, which, again, could be done in response to another work, or might just be similar to your results. So I'm going to pull up quickly each one of these, just to give you some examples. And I should have done this probably prior, because this is probably really slow. Have any of you seen some of these alternative types of publications, like research briefs or letters to the editor? No? That's no. I'm going to pull them all up and we can go through them. Okay. Paper itself, I don't know how well you can see this. And we'll go through these sections, but this is a typical research paper with the abstract. You can see there, oops. All right. The abstract, and then the different sections. I don't think I can scroll on this. And then the different sections. So we have the introduction, the methods, which we'll talk about in a second, and then the results, and of course the tables are interspersed throughout. Most of these are coming from the American Journal of Public Health. The guidelines for publishing are different depending on the journal you go to. But so the basic field, results, and then discussion, or conclusion and discussion, depending on where you go, acknowledgments, references, perhaps appendices if you have them. So your typical scientific paper, which we'll talk about in great detail. The briefs, this is an example of a brief. I'll try to pull out the PDF because it's easier to see. And it's a small study. This author is looking at characteristics of opioid prescriptions in 2009. And it's tough to see. She gives a bit of background about opioids, the methods that she's used to test her question. She's looking at a very descriptive type of research. So they're looking at prescription practices in the U.S. and using that to identify them as possible contributors to the high rate of opioid use in the U.S. So a very descriptive type of research, but she's got methods, results, and one figure, I believe, in this. So briefs typically have one figure, maybe one table. They're much shorter. And then the discussion or comment. So very short. APHA's this is actually a JAMA brief. APHA's briefs are about 800 words max. So much shorter, but a good, quick way to get your work out there. And a field action report. This is an example of a field action report from AJPH, the American Journal of Public Health. And Ohio, and they are talking about a program called Elder Smile. So it's a comprehensive approach to improving oral health for seniors. Oops, I think it does. Sorry, y'all. It does actually let me scroll to some extent. Okay. Yeah, where is it?
Right back before it says public health.
Keep moving
Bar,
to
bar.
Where am I?
the left, to the little bit.
Little bit to it.
There we go.
Yep.
Where's the PDF link? This is nuts. I
Use
probably
that
went back.
blue-
Yeah. Or full text link. There we go. So anyway, just a brief report on their program. And again, they give a bit of background about why this is important, why their projects are important. It also has an abstract. All field reports typically also summarize the work. And then there's some key findings too. So it's very descriptive, talking about their program, what their project looks like, where they are, and perhaps their anticipated results. It's very much just a field action report, but an important publication. And it's at an earlier stage of research, which is also fine. Typically we wait until the research question has been tested and the results are in to publish, but we can publish throughout. We can publish at the beginning. We can talk about the design or problems that we've encountered along the way. These are all very valid modes of communication and publishing our results. And let's see, this one is a letter to the editor. I won't go through that. But it varies. Oh, actually, this is a review article, sorry. Again, review articles are just syntheses of larger bodies of work. They give an abstract, just as most research papers do, with the objective, the data sources that they've used to synthesize, the study selection and methods, and the results and conclusion. And so a review article tends to look more like a scientific paper, but it is a collection of a body of work and many research papers. And then the letters to the editor might come in various forms. This one that I've given you here is actually responding to a published work from another author in the same journal. This is AJPH. And again, Dr. Green just says, you know, I'm responding to this. This is what we found. So letters are very common in that sense too, and another way to get your work out quick and dirty. And there are other types of publications, again, depending on your field. These are pretty specific to public health and what we see more often. Depending on your field, you might have some alternatives as well. So, where you publish and sort of your mode of publication is going to be, it's dependent on your research and the aims of your research. That will gauge where you publish, what type of body of work you publish. You also want to think, though, about the audience and the reach. That will gauge where you decide to go with your work and how you decide to communicate that. If you want a broad audience, you know, you consider alternative journals. If you want more specific, let's say those of us in public health, we might consider public health specific journals. Journals like JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine. These are a much broader audience, although maybe more medically oriented. So again, it's going to depend on your audience. It will depend on your discipline too, in terms of where you decide to publish. And then what you also might consider in publishing is the characteristics of the journals themselves. One that we often consider is the impact factor, which is used as almost a gauge of the importance of that journal. And it's calculated by the number of citations from that journal. So a journal like JAMA or New England Journal, these have huge impact factors compared to maybe something a little more obscure. AIDS and behavior, impact factors vary very widely on the far end. Most hover around less than 5. But that might gauge where you decide to go in terms of publishing. And also the requirements of the journal, word counts, tables and figures, guidelines. These all might, gauge how you want to present your results. In public health, just to give you 2 examples, the American Journal of Epidemiology and the American Journal of Public Health are pretty restricted in their word limits. So they're very pithy, and if you want to put more theory into it, they might not be the best fit for you, but again, that might be the audience you want to reach. So the word count, the number of tables and figures, these can all play a role too. But no matter what type of publication you decide to do with your work, all of these go through scientific review, a peer review, which is not always a great process, which is why it's very good, and I think I talked about this at the end, to have your colleagues review it first, to really get that constructive feedback. And that's for papers, that's also for grant proposals, for everything you do, to get your constructive criticism in-house before you get it out the house. So there's lots of different types of publications. The most common that you will probably encounter, and one we'll talk about, is a scientific research paper. And it really comes in, it's really a story. And it's nice to think of it that way because I think that helps in writing. Because you can think of it as a story with four main parts. One is the question, your research question, and the impact that question has on the field. 2 is the methods that you've used to answer the question. 3, the results that you found, and then the answer and how that relates to what you know in the field. And so the main sections that we're used to seeing are here listed for you. First, we always, and this is done last, let's start with the title page. And again, that's going to be journal specific. Typically, most journals want you to include a long title and then a short running title. The authors, their affiliations, and the corresponding author. Who can they contact? Who can the readers contact for more information? Second part is the abstract, which is written last. And then most journals want keywords. Now these are taken from the mesh headings in PubMed and Index Medicus so that your article is more likely to be pulled up and perhaps cited. So you want to use keywords that are in the mesh listings in the headings. Then the meat of the paper are these 4 sections: the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. So that's where you're going to spend most of your time writing. Acknowledgements are key. References, of course, and tables and figures, or however you're choosing to present your results. So the sections in brief. Abstract is really what did I do in a nutshell. What was it about? Very briefly, what did I find? What's the significance of this finding? The introduction and the background and the objectives are really telling your reader what is the problem and what did I do to address that problem, or how did I add to this evidence base. The methods, how did I solve the problem or help to address it, and the results, what did I find out. And then most importantly, what does that mean, and what does it mean to the bigger picture. The acknowledgements are acknowledging who helped you out. That includes perhaps your field staff, research staff, your funding, your funders, your stakeholders. These all must be acknowledged. And then the citations or the references referring to what you cited throughout, and I have some guidelines for that. And appendices are optional. So some journals will allow you to have appendices, and these come in handy if you do have extra information, maybe tables, maybe figures that are beyond the limited guidelines for that. So the abstract, again, it's a brief summary. You want to talk about the question that you posed or your purpose of the study, the methods that you use, but without going into excessive detail, just some key methods, key techniques, the major findings or the results, and then a brief summary of what you found. So that's the abstract in a nutshell. We've seen lots of these. You've probably seen many. This is, again, an AJPH research and practice article. And there's their objective. They are looking at the effect of smoking on cognitive decline over a 5-year period. So a cohort study among middle-aged individuals. So again, pretty descriptive purpose. They're telling the authors or the readers what they've done. They've used a cohort study, time frame, and the association and how they tested that. They don't go into great detail. They just say that it was assessed. And then the results and the conclusion. And so they did find an effect, and their conclusion is that interventions to prevent or stop people from smoking might postpone decline in middle-aged persons. So abstract in a nutshell. The introduction establishes context. So it really tells your reader, what's known in the field, what's the relevant literature, and what's the current understanding of the problem. And then how does my study really add to that, and what do I want to investigate in this research? It must ideally answer these questions. What were you studying? Why is that an important question? What did we already know about it before you conducted your study? And then how will it advance knowledge? Again, we want it to advance our knowledge base. When writing an introduction, typically it goes from being very broad to specific. And so, if you sift around any scientific journal and look through the research papers, they all have a similar flow. So again, kind of a broad spectrum of the problem, what's known, and then getting into more specific detail, and then finally how that relates to your study. So in this case, this is the same cohort of individuals. They're talking about the aging of the population and the importance of smoking, and then what studies have found so far with respect to smoking and cognitive decline, and what's missing. So here, again, getting more specific, very few studies have examined the relationship specifically between smoking and cognitive function in middle age. That's what their study adds. And then here's, finally, is the research question. It's typically stated as the purpose of the study. So when you see a published paper, your research question is typically worded as the purpose of your study was to investigate the association between X and Y. So again, broad to specific. This is a very short, very pithy American Journal of Public Health intro. If you're used to publishing, and if you're from, the social science field, you'll see a lot more theory. Again, still broad to specific, but much greater detail in terms of what's new. The methods explains how your study was carried out, who were the subjects, how were they recruited, how many refusals did you have, what was the response rate, what was the study site, what was the study design, the outcomes and the variables, the reliability and validity, if they're applicable, and the protocol for collecting data and how they were analyzed. So how did you analyze the data? So really all of the methods in a nutshell. And being as detailed as possible, because again, how you conducted the study speaks very highly to the quality of the finding and the quality of the data. And you want to give your reader as much information as you can about how that was conducted. Now, depending on the journal, you might only have a bit of room for this. So getting as much in as possible is always key. But you want to divulge all that you've done methods-wise. The results are where you present your key results. And these are written without interpretation. So you don't want to interpret the results in the results section. You just want to present them as is. And the results sections typically follow an orderly sequence based on your tables and your figures. And so sort of taking the reader through just a description of the sample all the way down to the main hypothesis test that you've conducted. And any sub-analyses you've kind of done. I'll show you some examples in a second. You want to always point to your text, to your illustrative materials in the text. You don't want to say anything in the text that the reader can't get in the table or the figure. So tables and figures should stand alone, and you want to use your text as a guide to walk your reader through those. You want to avoid extraneous findings. You really want to stick to that research question and only that research question, which is sometimes hard for if you're first getting out and writing research. You have a lot of findings, and you want to report these, but you want your purpose of your paper to be very specific and take your reader through that one question. Save your extraneous findings for another publication. You also don't want to mix your methods into your results. So if you did do a sub-analysis, let's say a stratification, or you identified interaction or something to that effect, you want to add that to your methods section. So it might be important that you found some interaction, but then go back and put that in the methods so that the reader knows you were doing this a priori, and then they're able to follow that. Rule of thumb, and this comes from some of these slides, I should say, or from other presentations I've done, also Dr. Kendall, this is one Dr. Kendall gave me, about writing the results in 5 or less depending on your research question, paragraphs. So first, starting with the study population, which is typically your table 1, just describing the study sample, what did they look like, and then finally moving to the primary outcome and the main association. So maybe your bivariate analysis. If you're looking at a particular intervention's impact, how did it impact your outcome overall? And then your primary hypotheses, actually testing that impact, focusing on, confounders, all of the important things you need to test and take into account when testing that hypothesis. So in some journals, you might not present a bivariate table. You might have a descriptive table that also includes bivariate results. That's very common as well. But most scientific articles you write and you'll see include some type of multivariate analysis. Your primary hypotheses adjusting for X, Y, and Z. You also might have sub-analyses. Again, if you detected interaction and you want to present a stratified analysis, any examinations of secondary aims, trends over time, and so forth. So just general guidelines there. The discussion interprets your results in light of what you already know. And so it explains your understanding of this problem based on what you just found or what you found. And so you really want to connect to your introduction by the way of your hypotheses that you presented earlier in the introduction in all of your literature. And that's typically done first. You always want to discuss the limitations. I say strengths and limitations, but limitations over strengths if you have the room. Again, that's going to depend on the journal and how much room you have to talk about limitations, but no study is without its limitations. And again, the more you give the reader and the methods and data collection, the less you really have to say in limitations as well, because they can infer that from what you've done in the study or how the study was done. You don't want to just repeat the results. That's key for the discussion. It's really an interpretation of the results and how that fits into the larger field of context. So you don't want to just repeat what you did in the results section. Some additional tips for the discussion: you want to stick to your data and your findings. Again, don't present anything extraneous. It's okay to speculate and to talk about maybe new hypotheses that your research might have generated, but you don't want to include anything that's new to do. Again, go back and put that into your methods. Avoid using the term that more research is needed unless you state what is needed, and then that's a very common thing you might see in some of the published works. In terms of acknowledgments, so again, acknowledgments typically come after your discussion or your conclusion, but sometimes you'll see them up front. Some journals require acknowledgments on the title page. It just depends on where they're to be placed. But typically it's between the discussion and the literature cited. And here you want to list people that gave you any significant help in designing and carrying out the study, and of course your sources of funding. Very key. And to give you an example from that research study, here's an acknowledgement talking about how the cohort study was funded by the Ministry of Health, Welfare, and the National Institute for Public Health and Environment. And then they thank the epidemiologists and the field workers, and they list it here. Typically, you want to contact the folks you're going to be thanking, just to let them know. That does not always happen, but it's nice to do. So, and then finally, the last section is literature cited or references. And these are references that you actually cited in your paper or in your body of work. You will have probably 10 times the number of articles that you've read, that you've digested to understand the research and the context, but you're only citing certain ones. And so your literature, a reference list are only those that are cited in the paper. And rules of thumb that I've always used and been taught are that 10 to 15 are usually sufficient for the introduction. It's going to depend on your research question, but you don't want to excessively use too many references if you use a few to make your point. 0 to 3 in your methods section, you might be using some analytical technique that's brand new. Typically you won't be citing much in your methods section. 0 citations in your results. This is strictly your work. And of course, kind of following from the intro, about 10 to 15 for the discussions is a rule of thumb. Some of these are probably used in an introduction as well, as you kind of tie back to that. The format of citations depends on the journal. American Journal of Public Health uses American Medical Association format. If you're maybe more of a social scientist, you'll probably maybe use APA, the American Psychological Association. It really depends on the journal. And the easiest way is to use a referencing system like EndNote, RefWorks, so that you can easily switch from one type of format to another. So let's say I submit to the American Journal of Public Health and it's rejected, and then I submit to maybe a more social science journal who requires a different format. I can easily switch those referencing formats pretty easily. And of course your reference list must be complete. That is key. You wouldn't think that reviewers pick up on that a bit, but many do. So those are the main parts of the paper, and we'll talk about kind of writing them. I wanted to mention, though, authorship. It's a really sticky, can be a sticky situation depending on your research and who you're working with. There are different guidelines for authorship depending on your field. The medical field is somewhat similar to many of the social science fields. In biomedical situations, many will place maybe the lab lead or the main PI of a laboratory on the paper last, as kind of just, it's his or her lab. And that's pretty common, even if he or she didn't do anything for the manuscript. And again, in public health, it's just going to depend on your area and your field. But rules of thumb are that an author must have all 3 criteria. 1, they have to have contributed substantially to the conception, design of the study, or the acquisition of data, or the analysis and interpretation. So they really have had to contribute to that. They also have had to provide revision and drafting of that article. And that could just be, comments to your Word draft, but they have to have given input into that article and understand the whole study. They have to be able to actually talk about your research if you're unable to. And they have to have provided final approval of the version to be published. That, again, if you're just adding ghost authors on there, that's not always the case. But every author should have contributed to that manuscript. And most journals, at least in public health, require every author to have a signature page and sign off on the copyright. Other journals don't. And so, again, it just depends on where you go, but keep that in mind. In terms of writing the paper, so again, just some rules of thumb here. It's going to depend on what you're most comfortable doing as you kind of start writing. But typically you start with the outcome and with the results. I always say start with the table, start with the figures. Before you even conduct the research, it's actually good to create dummy tables or dummy figures. And all I mean by that is a table without anything in it. So kind of thinking about how you might present, or how you want to construct your table 1. Maybe you have, you're listing it by exposed, non-exposed, and then by your total population, and then all of your independent variables, age, sex, what have you. Without any data in it, that'll give you a feel for, how do I want to actually collect this data, and how do I want to operationalize some of these independent variables for exposure. So that's a good idea, first and foremost, but it's also a great place to start as you start writing. And so once you have your tables and figures done, you can talk about the results and the findings. And so after that's done, really walk through those main findings, the tables and figures, and really start to populate that results section. And that's key. After that's done, and again, these are just rules of thumb, the most straightforward way is to interpret those results. You've just written the results, now interpret them. And so that feeds into your discussion. And so these are key pieces to be done first. And then you want to ensure that you go back to the methods and make sure they match your results. Methods are typically easy to write, they're very straightforward. But you want to do that after your results, after your discussion, so that they definitely match what you've done. And then the introduction, I suggest writing that after these other main, meatier sections, because now you know where you're going. It's a little easier, to guide the reader after you know what you've done and how you've interpreted that. That's not always the case. I mean, typically you can get a good intro going, but as far as really finalizing the introduction, it should be done last. And then, of course, title, definitely, you might have a working title up front, but you really want it main finding. And so you want to kind of go back to that toward the end of your writing. And an abstract, definitely written last. It just falls into place after you've done everything else. And so those are, again, just some rules of thumb for writing. Some other rules of thumb, first step is to get organized. And so, again, the best papers are really hinged on one main finding, keeping it as simple as can be. If you feel that it's too much, that it probably should be more than one paper. So figure out what findings you want to present. Avoid saying everything. Again, keep it simple. And find a minimal publishable unit. Kind of what one of my colleagues told me. And you have to know the literature. And so really being a scholar in that realm is going to be key too. Second, know where you're going. So always obtain the instructions for authors from the journal where you want to publish, because they're going to give you the key guidelines you need for what you need to include. And it's a good idea too to maybe read papers from journals you want to publish in. Take a look at AJPH, take a look at JAMA, really kind of get a feel for, how do people write, how do people present their work, and then how can I model that in what I've done. Third good step is to make an outline. So you want an outline with sufficient detail with major subheadings for each one, so an outline for each of our meatier sections, and then one line for each point that you want to make in each of those. Again, using subheadings for methods and results. You always want to go from general to more specific, and ideally you want to keep your manuscript together in one file. So an example of an outline, let's say just for an introduction, again, you might start with some general points that you want to make. Again, what's known, what's not known, and what we did. And just kind of getting your outline for each section. So this is for introduction, do the same thing for methods, do the same thing for results, do the same thing for discussion. Again, maybe after you've already analyzed, and then just jot your thoughts down as you go along. Start writing after the outline. Fill in the sentences, being concise as can be, but just writing. You're just getting it down on paper. You're going to have many, many revisions, but the easiest thing to do is just to start writing. And don't stop. And so in summary, we talked about the value of manuscripts. As you know, every research paper is important. It does add to the evidence base, and even if it's a negative finding, it might be hard to publish, but don't give up. There's a home, and hopefully, as you search the evidence base for your research topic, you're looking very broadly at what's out there and what's been found. Testing and determining your question is going to depend on many things. There are various ways to go about that. And again, your research question is going to drive what you decide to publish, and that often drives where you decide to publish. It's all going to depend on your work and the best fit for that work. And then we talked about parts of a scientific paper. I spoke really in general terms here, but it's pretty similar, no matter if whether you're in a social science field or a biomedical field. Introduction, methods, results, discussion are the main sections that you really work on. And that's about it. I have a lot of just lanyap slides that I gave in terms of just writing, but you can read those. And I ran over probably more than I wanted to, but do you guys have any questions about anything about publishing?
You talked about the impact factor. Do you just have to find that on each individual place, or is there like a collective area you can find impact factor?
Both.
Okay.
We have a collect, and I can't remember who started the collection. it's very public health specific. I believe that was from an author, but typically from the journal.
Okay.
And if they don't make it public, it's probably low, but contact them too. And that's not always the case. And they change. I mean, they do this annually. So I've seen journals go from 1.5 to 5 in no time, just depending on the field. Particularly for HIV, a lot of HIV journals were high, and now they sometimes take it off from some of them. There's a lot of
I have just a couple of questions, and you can just attack them as you may. How do you deal with rejections from publications? Sometimes some journals will hold your work for months, maybe. How do you deal with that? And what do you think has made you such a prolific publisher?
Well, let's start with the first question. Rejection it's tough. I mean, I'm fine with rejection, but I have a lot of colleagues that, I have one colleague who has saved every publication. And so you have to, it's part of the game. Many articles on average, I think 4 or 5 rejections for every published is not uncommon. So don't be discouraged. That's my key there. Do not be discouraged. You're going to be rejected many times. So just let it go. And that's for publishing and for grant writing too, depending on where you are in your field. As far as the holding issue is a big one, and there are journals. My advice is to go to journals that have a quick turnaround first, so that you get a feel for for how interested they are in it, but maybe the reviewers as well. AJPH is really quick. I'll tell you right off the bat. You can also contact the journal and the editor and say, look, this is my work, this is what I have. Is this something you'd be interested in? For those that hold it a long time, it's just about staying on them and then maybe withdrawing. If it's more than 6 months and you haven't come back, I would take it out and try somewhere else.
You can take it out.
You can withdraw a submission in most cases. I'm speaking in general. I'm sure there are journals that do not allow that. Or just be patient. But if it's a timely finding, you want it out. In that case, you might just do it weekly. Prolific publication-wise. Like I said, I've published in a lot of obscure journals too.
But you don't feel like that affects you, or I don't know. I mean, what are the reasons?
Yeah, and I say obscure. No, but I say like I've gone to AIDS and Behavior. I've gone to discipline-specific journals before I go to JAMA. Or I know when something's JAMA worthy or New England Journal worthy, and so that's helped. But also just writing, just outlining, and just getting it down, and really, kind of keeping it simple, keeping that one research question in mind throughout, and just, kind of dealing with writer's block, taking a break, and doing, sitting down to the components I'm most comfortable with. But I find that if I analyze, populate the tables and the figures, the rest of the paper really writes itself.
And one quick timeline question: how long from results, you actually getting your results, to actually writing the paper?
It depends on the question and how many people are involved. If it's just me, I can do that in a couple of days. If I'm working with a team, it could take months. And so that's another thing I didn't mention about authorship. If you have 8 or 9 authors, and each it could be a year until your results are published. And so, if it's a very important finding, you want to think carefully about that, and give them some strict deadlines. Say, look, I'm submitting in a week. If I don't hear back from you, you're off, or that's it. But that just depends. You can do it pretty quickly, but it's going to depend on your analyses. The longest part is conducting research. Analyzing and reporting is easier. Any other questions? There's some guidelines after this and just writing in general. Theory, yeah. Yeah, it's like I said, it's tough to throw in a lot of theory in AJPH or American Journal of Epi. Some of our public health journals are pretty tight, but you want to talk about it in the introduction when you talk about the purpose and how you designed your research question. That your research question was based on theories X, Y, and Z, or you're contributing to a certain theory based on what you found. So typically in the introduction, if you're going to social science and medicine, or there are a lot of journals who really want to see a lot of discussion on theory. So it just depends on the question and where you go. Public health, very good. Any other questions?
You talked about the order to write the papers. How about as an author to revise the paper, especially a paper is written by a student and you have in-house to rewrite that?
Yes. It is tough. It's a fine line. Some co-authors will do much more than others. If it is maybe a student writing the paper, you as a co-author will put a lot of work into maybe revising. Maybe you've even suggested a research question. And so that's where it really becomes a fine line in terms of who's first. And I think I suggest negotiating that up front, particularly if you are a student, because that's when you can really get into some sticky situations. And you might not even be on the paper, but your whole work is taken. So it's tough.
Sorry, I just kind of
Yeah.
Because I know some people are leaving and our time is ending, so I think you can stick around.
Yeah, I
for
can
a
stick
minute or
around
two.
for, yeah.
So, first I want to thank you. Run out of time to say that I know not all of you got the handouts. If you didn't, make sure that you sign in and put a star next to your name, and we can get those to you. So please do that. And please fill out an evaluation, and specifically in additional comments, if you have ideas about other communication seminars you'd like to see, please put that. And finally, this Friday, we have a Prevention Research Center seminar, Active by Design. It'll be at noon in room 1208, and it's about supporting healthy communities through environmental change. And next Tuesday, the Maternal and Child Health Leadership Training Program is co-sponsoring with the breastfeeding program movie Latching On, the Politics of Breastfeeding in America. And that'll be in room 1203 at noon. So I hope you can join us for either or both of those. So, and then, if you have other questions, please do, but I just want to make sure that everyone knows you can get them.